Hello, my name is Stephen Doig. I'm the Director of Research at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. And I just wanted to welcome you all today to our series, New Energy, Conversations with Early Career Energy Researchers. I have the pleasure today to introduce two people. One is Elise Harrington, is at the University of Minnesota, and she will be speaking on the topic of off-grid solar distribution models and consumer safeguards in rural Kenya, as well as Heidi Ries, who is also at the University of Minnesota and will actually be hosting today's event, given her knowledge and connections with University of Minnesota. So without further ado, I'd like to just get things kicked off. And I think, Heidi, you're the lead person from here.
Great. Yes, I'm Heidi Ries. I am a climate and energy researcher at the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. The Institute on the Environment is an interdisciplinary hub that brings experts together to address complex sustainability challenges, including advancing energy transitions. I am very pleased to introduce Elise Harrington. Dr. Harrington is an assistant professor in the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy area at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. She studies infrastructure, energy, and environmental policy making with a focus on how interpersonal relationships and social organization influence the design and implementation of policies, programs, and services. Elise holds a PhD in environmental policy and planning from MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Elise will be talking for about 25 minutes about her research on off-grid renewable energy and consumer protections in rural Kenya. After, there'll be a question and answer session following her presentation. So put your questions in the Q&A feature below. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Elise and mute my camera and audio.
Well, thank you, Heidi, for the introduction, and thank you to the New Energy series and to Stephen for inviting me here to speak with you today. So first, I want to give a bit of an introduction to the kind of work that I do. And so as a social scientist, really interested in kind of how social ties and values influence behavior and technology adoption, I really try to work with others that approach the issue of behavior and technology from a different lens, and that's often kind of a different discipline. And so for the work that I'm talking about today, much of the data collection and exploration of kind of small scale off-grid solar in Kenya was done in partnership with the Strathmore Energy Research Center based in Nairobi, Kenya, and in particular with a close collaborator in Wachera Wambugu. And oops, sorry. And here you can see a picture of us doing some exploratory focus groups in Trans Nzoia County, Kenya. And so I just wanted to start this out by really emphasizing how pursuing interdisciplinary research for addressing complex energy problems really sits at the center of how I approach this work. And this kind of relates to a larger framing of the work that I do on how policy decisions about energy and climate change translate down to the local level and ultimately to those who are the end users of technologies, can be the targets of behavior change policies, and often those really most impacted by the policy decisions at higher levels. So I like to use this idea of like a layered slice of cake. You know, there's all of these layers and activities happening at different levels, and how do we start to kind of bridge across them so that we understand, you know, how policies that might be designed with a very technical focus are experienced at this very kind of local and interpersonal level. And so depending on the issue at hand, kind of the order and the components of this layering might change. But what I'm really talking about here today is thinking about how some of these technical decisions really made at international and kind of high level government levels are translated down to the individual kind of household level. So when it comes to thinking about off-grid solar distribution models and consumer safeguards in Kenya, I want to unpack a bit of the context to this work and what this means. So let's start with this idea of off-grid solar. So in the context of rural Kenya and in rural communities kind of globally, off-grid solar refers primarily to these two categories that you can see here on this slide highlighted kind of in the color. And this really focuses on Pico Solar, so small scale lanterns that can provide kind of light sources and can also provide phone charging to home systems that might provide multiple light points and can provide some access to slightly larger appliances. And most often these technologies are used in regions of the country and regions of the world that don't have access to the centralized grid, or in some cases, don't have access to a reliable connection to the grid. And so they'll use these technologies kind of as backup or as supplements to the grid. And you can see in this image how these off-grid solar technologies fit in kind of the suite of options that can be used to provide electricity access. So for those of you who might be joining today from the United States, you might be really familiar with grid access for our electricity, but this really emphasizes that experience can vary globally and based on where you are, and that some people really do rely on these small scale solar products kind of in their day-to-day electricity access. And so just to give a sense of what these technologies might look like on the ground, here's a picture of a really common kind of solar lantern used to provide primarily lighting, but can also provide cell phone charging. And then here's another example of solar home system. So that might provide multiple lighting points. And I really like to show this picture because I think it provides a couple of really important dimensions to think about when you think about the diversity of technologies being used in rural communities to achieve electricity access. So the first thing to note in this picture is if you look on the left, you can actually see this household is connected to the grid. They have a wire coming into their house, yet they still have and are using solar. And what you can also see in this picture is that they have 3 solar panels on their roof, and those solar panels are different, suggesting that this household has kind of added capacity over time as either they've been financially able to add that, or as they've wanted to increase, kind of the variety of appliances in their house. And some of this kind of flexibility that off-grid solar introduces to households is one of the reasons that it can be viewed as, an attractive solution to electrification. And in general, this approach of thinking about off-grid solar as a component of electricity access fits into, a movement away from understanding electricity access as a binary measure. So historically, this has really been aligned with the notion of electricity access as you do or do not have a connection to the centralized grid. But more recently, there's been an effort to really try and kind of unpack what it means to have electricity access. And really kind of this has been broken out into an understanding of kind of tiers of electricity access. This approach has really been promoted by the World Bank and international partners and breaks this binary measure down into a whole bunch of different component parts. And so what you can see here on this slide is this notion of going what really is from tier 0 up to tier 5 of electricity access. And this information on this slide really focuses on the end use of that electricity. So what are you able to do with it? Do you have task lighting? Can you use a television? And then all the way up to kind of really being able to have high powered appliances. And one of the additional ways that this tiered approach to electricity access understands the notion of access is also to look at measures of, well, how many hours per day does a household have this? Or how reliable, do they face a lot of outages? How reliable is this service? And how affordable is this? And as indicated here on this slide, the focus of most of what I'm talking about with you all today really centers on these kind of tier 1 and tier 2 levels of access, the basic lighting and appliances that households will get through these off-grid solar technologies. And additionally, this tiered based approach becomes even more important when you start to see how it's playing into kind of the current evolution of electrification policy and strategies. So this tiered based approach is now a component of Kenya's national electrification strategy, where certain regions of the country that were unlikely to see grid extension in the near future are being explicitly targeted for electricity access with these off-grid solar technologies aimed at this tier 1 level or above. And one thing to note about off-grid solar use in Kenya is that, it has been around for a while, but it has also grown substantially in recent years. So estimates suggest that in 2000, perhaps about 4.2% of rural households in Kenya had some kind of solar system. And more recently in 2017, it was estimated that about 30% of households that are not connected to the grid have a solar product. And so that estimate likely includes both lanterns and home systems, and you can ask a lot of questions about, well, does that include, these grid connected houses that are also using these systems as backup? And we don't have a great amount of data to understand really the use and distribution of these systems, but what data we do have really does suggest some amount of growth. And Kenya has really, because of this kind of early adoption of solar technologies, been considered a leader in household use of solar for at least a couple decades now. But one of the early issues identified with off-grid solar in Kenya was kind of the prevalence of poor quality products. And so in the early 2000s, scholars really characterized the situation in Kenya as a market for lemons, where the prevalence of poor quality solar products in Kenya was inhibiting the sale of these higher quality products, due to issues like diminished consumer expectations. And so in response to this, Kenya was included in early international efforts to try and address some of these quality issues. And so this includes being a pilot country for Lighting Africa, which was funded by the World Bank and the IFC to develop standards and test methods for quality that really became criteria for participating in donor programs and international finance. And this work continues on today with a much expanded scope since this early pilot work in Kenya under the much larger umbrella of Lighting Global. And so this is where we really start to see what does it mean to have some of these consumer safeguards for off-grid solar? How are we protecting consumers when it comes to things like quality? And today I'm really focused on quality. There are other aspects to this broad set of consumer safeguards as well. And this action has not only happened at the very high level international level, but also within the Kenyan government. So in the early 2000s, Kenya passed the first technical performance standards for solar photovoltaics. But this applied primarily to what is called a component-based system. And so if you look in this picture here, you can see on the left, panels, PV panels, on the right, a battery, on the center, a battery, and on the right, what are these kind of kit-based components. And so these early performance standards really focused on what you see on the left, these kind of panels that you would go to a shop and buy on its own. And in the shop, you'd kind of put together this set of a solar home system with that shop owner that kind of, you get your panel and your battery, but each is really kind of a separate component part. This kit-based model that you see on the right is an increasingly common model for off-grid solar products and services. And so it's where these lanterns and home systems, but especially the home systems, come bundled together. So you get your battery, your panel, all of the components are bundled together with also your light points, appliances, and they're all financed together as well. And so these early standards really applied to what we see on the left of this page and not so much on the right. And so for the last 10 years, there's been this ongoing effort to try to develop quality standards that also apply to this kit-based model that you see here on the right. And so in 2010, we started to see the first standard applied to Pico Solar. So those are the lanterns that you see me in the first couple images on that first row in the right. And then in 2015, standards for these larger systems that have multiple appliances that are considered these kit-based solar home systems. And then just last year in 2020, a new standard was adopted, and this applied to kind of merge this Pico Solar and the solar home system kit-based approach in one standard. And just within the last couple of weeks, if not last week or the week before, Kenya has kind of adopted this most recent technical standard for these systems. And so this brings us to the question of there is a lot of activity happening to try and build in these quality safeguards for the off-grid solar sector at the international level and at the kind of state level in Kenya. And how is that starting to impact or affect kind of those people on the ground using and really relying on these solar home systems in their day-to-day lives? And without going into too much detail, a lot of these technical standards are developed with country representatives in a consensus-based model at an international level. And so this happens at the International Electrotechnical Commission. And then those can be adopted and then sometimes modified by country standards agencies. And so that's what it means when kind of Kenya has adopted the most recent standard. There was an effort to kind of revise this at an international level. And then within the country, this has been now adopted as a Kenyan standard. And really, without focusing on that too much, the implications for end users of off-grid solar are that quality standards, these decisions that happen at the international and then at the state level, really guide a lot of the information that is disclosed related to these off-grid solar products and services. And this really falls into requirements that kind of adhere to truth in advertising, to performance reporting, and minimum warranty terms. There's also kind of a broader category of consumer-facing information, but here you can start to see the kinds of things that should be trickling down from this international level of kind of how should we look at quality? How should we develop standards that protect consumers in this? And then what should consumers start to be aware about when it comes to these off-grid solar products? And so here you can see things, some really fundamental components like the manufacturer's name, the product number, and then other dimensions such as solar runtime. How long can someone use this lantern or this solar home system at a certain light setting if they charge it for a full day? And what happens to that, for example, when you add appliances? And then you can see kind of, okay, let's think about minimum warranty terms. How long do they last? what actually does a warranty cover? So manufacturing defects and protection from early component failure. That warranty information is in a language that people know and understand, and that it really begins from this date of purchase, when the end user purchased this solar product. And so from some preliminary field work from this, and then a prior project that I did in India, it was pretty clear that while this information that is coming through these standards is absolutely being included on some product labels and in advertising, it didn't have as large of a role as I expected in kind of how individuals, how end users were making decisions about their solar products. And this really emphasized to me, okay, you have to translate down to, okay, how are people receiving these off-grid solar services? And really to taking a moment to look at the distribution models that go in hand with off-grid solar services. And what I found was that, especially, so starting with this work in India, what we started to see was that when it came to quality, people were not looking for some kind of international stamp or international certification, but they really wanted to make a deal with the local shopkeeper about, repairs or ongoing service for their product. And so here on the left, you can see a picture of a local shopkeeper in Jharkhand, India, and that this is that person that end users will go to for help with their solar. And as I started exploring a lot of the work that was kind of foundational for my work in Kenya, in Arusha, Tanzania, it became really clear that these solar agents and technicians, so the people who go out and sell solar and the people who go out and install solar, play this really important role in kind of communicating certain information to solar end users. And it really did start to shift my focus to kind of who do people rely on for help when it comes to solar, when it comes to energy more broadly. And this role can really be played by a number of different actors. And so I just mentioned solar sales agents, and they play a really important role. And they will go out, they're often mobile, and they will kind of go out into the more rural areas of the country from kind of a center shop in the, usually like a larger town. But they're the ones making those relationships with the users of off-grid solar, and they play a really important role in building that consumer education. Other actors that play this critical kind of, connecting role are electricians. There are also members or leaders of farming groups. So this is a model used very frequently in rural Kenya for buying or for access to agricultural inputs, but they also provide access to household items that you might need, such as solar, also things like water tanks as well. And so here in this third picture on the top row, you can see an image from 1 Acre Fund, which is a big organization that works in multiple countries, but is very active in Kenya. And here you can see kind of it's a part of their model that people buy solar, and that they actually also are one of the venues that provides information about, well, what does it mean to have a warranty? What are these terms? And savings groups, as you go to the second row, savings groups are really similar to farming groups, but they're more broadly focused on kind of collective savings approaches. And then you can also rely on, people that your friends, your family, your neighbors for help with solar. And then again, like I previously introduced, kind of these entrepreneurs or shop owners. And broadly, these are the actors in kind of this off-grid solar network that I call frontline solar intermediaries. and they broadly facilitate kind of interactions between the end users of solar and the providers of solar. So these companies that are offering these solar products. But the term intermediary is used really broadly. And so what I'm focused down on are kind of this concept of a knowledge broker. And a knowledge broker acts to kind of mediate access to and the flow of information between actors. And they can often take steps that really tries to repackage or identify the most salient information for relevant parties. And as you can see on this slide, I've really focused my work on solar sales agents and electricians as these kind of critical knowledge brokers, because they've really kind of come up in conversation after conversation and in survey data were by far the kind of most referenced categories of people that people rely on for help with solar. And so in 2019, we fielded a survey in Trans Nzoia County, Kenya, to start exploring kind of this end user experience with solar, and to do some first measures of consumer knowledge about these quality standards. And there's really not a lot of available data out there that really captures how people understand the safeguards associated with quality standards or consumer protections. And so this was a really exciting first opportunity to try and explore some of those measures. And here I really focused on this issue of warranties for off-grid solar products, because they're one of the primary ways that the end users of off-grid solar can address an issue with their system that works within the framework of these kind of quality standards and doesn't require, for example, that a household buy an entirely new product. And so here I've identified kind of 3 variables that I explored about kind of warranty knowledge. So first, thinking about warranty terms, kind of that a warranty covers manufacturing defects and early component failure. The warranty, kind of the range of the duration that a warranty can have, so that it can last really from 1 to 2 years, 12 to 24 months. And then this issue of, well, if someone thinks that their warranty should be honored and it's not, that they can file a complaint. And the first 2 variables really start to focus on kind of recall measures of knowledge. And the last focuses on kind of more accountability or recourse mechanisms. And so just looking at these knowledge variables, we can see pretty decent knowledge. If you look here on the left, pretty decent knowledge about warranties in general. About 75% of the respondents in this survey, which is a little less than 900 people, you know, they knew the warranty terms and the warranty range, and that was pretty good. And then we can see about 60% of respondents knew to file a complaint. Each of these variables is a binary variable. So yes, they did answer this question correctly, or no, they did not. And then if we look here on the right, we can start to see how this kind of disaggregates out a little bit by these knowledge broker categories. So by the agent, the electrician, and then this other category of you know, other people that they rely on who aren't agents or electricians. And we see kind of some moderately consistent patterns across warranty terms, as well as warranty range, but a little bit of difference there. But really the biggest difference that you can see immediately from this figure on the right is kind of this knowledge of filing a complaint. And you can see that those who rely on agents do seem to be able to answer that, at least in this survey, you know, correctly more frequently than others. And so I really wanted to explore this relationship that you can start to see in this figure on the right. So here are 3 coefficient plots representing 3 different kind of binary logistic regressions with these knowledge variables as the outcome. and the frontline kind of knowledge broker as the key kind of predictor of interest. And I did also control for gender, household size, children, education, ethnicity, and location. And kind of, altogether, what these plots really do show us and how you read them is you look where there's a dotted line. To the left of the dotted line is negative, to the right of the dotted line is positive, and where there's no crossover with that dotted line and the blue line means that that result is statistically significant. And what I think one of the really important takeaways from this is that, there's no silver bullet here that's going to ensure that people, end users of off-grid solar have excellent, perfect knowledge about these consumer safeguards, but that there are ways that we can start to think about improving on them. So if we look all the way to the right at this issue of filing a complaint, we can see that relying on agents or electricians, both in comparison to kind of relying on others, actually does have a strong positive effect on this variable. So it does have a positive effect on if people know to file a complaint, if they feel like their warranty was not honored and it should be. If we go to the middle and we look at warranty duration, we see a positive effect for agents in comparison to others, and not really a difference for electricians. And then looking at warranty terms, we don't see a huge difference across these categories of knowledge brokers. There's a slight kind of negative relationship that is, just significant for electricians. And this actually kind of makes a little bit of sense when we think back to the kind of different types of solar systems that are at play. And there's these kit systems and there are these component-based systems. Electricians will tend to work more on these component-based systems, whereas agents really focus on these kits. And so the warranty kind of requirements that I presented before really kind of come through strongly in the kits. And so some of those patterns might also suggest, well, maybe these frontline knowledge brokers are acting in different areas of the off-grid solar ecosystem. And so these results really do show that kind of knowledge, is complex and can vary. But they also, I think that this finding about filing a complaint is pretty exciting because it also starts to get to this notion of how do you go from awareness or just information provision to acting on that. And so I really like to show this picture because it is a shop that has been basically painted like a billboard for an off-grid solar product. And you can see front and center is this kind of advertisement for a 2-year warranty associated with these solar products. And so one of the things that I think this data really shows pretty clearly is that, the notion of a warranty and even perhaps the duration of that warranty is pretty familiar, is at least becoming familiar in rural Kenya. And so the next question really becomes, well, do people act on that knowledge? How do we start to understand going from kind of awareness or information to action? And that's where I think that kind of filing a complaint question can start to indicate that maybe that is where these knowledge brokers play this really critical role. And this also points to what kind of some in the off-grid solar industry have called kind of the agent challenge, that I'm also saying is an opportunity, but that agents, because they're the ones that will go out into rural communities and build these strong relationships with solar users, they have this kind of cohesion. And this can be incredibly beneficial, as we see from some of those positive relationships with the knowledge variables. But there's also a lot of questions about how do we make sure agents are acting honestly and acting in good faith as they are this kind of key linchpin in off-grid solar systems. But what these results also show is that agents are one of kind of multiple knowledge brokers working in the off-grid solar sector. And that if we look at this agent, challenge, not only as a challenge, but also as an opportunity, that we can start to think about how agents might have, for example, a pathway to being an electrician or having new economic opportunities that might tie to things like local vocational schools, or existing kind of ways so that agents can see a pathway to economic growth and economic opportunity that might underpin, being honest and responsive in the way that they provide these services. So just to wrap up, this brings me back to this kind of layered cake idea and this question that says, well, yeah, actually, yes, some of these technical measures that are being developed, as consumer safeguards at an international level, operating worldwide, are making it down to the local level. But what I propose here is that also, there should be some transfer up. And so the question now becomes, like, how do we use these lessons, like which knowledge brokers are more effective at providing what kind of information to inform new policies and programs that help make sure that these quality assurance programs and safeguards are really kind of actionable by those at the local level. And with that, as I wrap up, I just wanted to thank again the team behind all of this work. So big thanks again to Anne, my close collaborator on this, and the wonderful set of enumerators that we had at Pearson Research Consulting to help collect data. And this really would not have been possible without them. So it takes a team to do field work like this, and I'm very grateful. And thank you all for joining in, and I'm excited for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Elise. That was awesome.
Thank you.
First question, how does this apply to the US? You mentioned the access questions, the tiered access in Kenya, and that we do not understand it that way in the US. What are the implications here in the US as we consider energy justice questions and electrification and that sort of thing?
Yeah, Heidi, that's a great question. And I think that one of the things that I think work like this in Kenya, really should be reflected back and say, like, are we thinking about the many dimensions to electricity access in the same way here? I mean, let's think about just Texas this week. There are places in the country right now that are really coming, facing the effects of a kind of perhaps fragile electricity system, and what a broader set of looking at kind of a multi-dimensional way to look at access says, well, do we have critical backup for health facilities? Do we have, how do we start to break this out into components that look at not just, do you have electricity or not in terms of being connected to the grid, but can you use those services and can you use them in a critical time? And if there is an outage, well, who needs to have service? And there's a big emphasis in even in rural households that really don't have a lot of financial resources, but they kind of bear a burden of having these backup sources because they face any number of unpredictable outages on a much more frequent basis than we do here. But I do think we are starting to see that we might need to have, even here, a broader set of measures of what it means to have electricity access, and then who has that access, right? You mentioned questions of energy justice. Well, how do we make sure that those who get their service restored, for example, most quickly are also, those in most need, and not just the wealthiest, most well-resourced neighborhoods of a city. And that comes again to these data, like, we don't know how to measure a lot of this really effectively, but they're really critical questions when it comes to access.
How do the standards, well, it's not really the standards, it's are business models for off-grid solar changing based on this knowledge broker idea? I mean, are they not focusing on international standards as much and realizing that actually it's the trusted advisors that make people use the equipment?
I would say that the large majority of international effort and even state effort in Kenya focuses on defining technical quality standards. Okay. There's very little kind of work that really is looking at, well, how do we maybe guide these knowledge brokers in certain ways? And that's where I think there's this real opportunity. And it is increasingly recognized by the off-grid solar kind of industry that these agents, for example, play this really critical role. And there have been a range of kind of ways that companies have tried to address this. So one of the things that companies have tried to do is provide, call-in lines and things like that in some ways circumvent this agent. And so I think there's kind of two models. That one that says, do you circumvent them if they're failing in certain ways? And then perhaps the model that I'm maybe arguing should be explored more, which is like, well, how do we actually build them into the ecosystem such that they have incentives to act, reliably? And because they have this, people are going to rely on them no matter what. In some of my focus groups in Kenya, people said, like, why would I trust some call center that's in Nairobi versus someone who I know, who I have their number and I can call them? And I think that there is a little bit of a disconnect between this notion of these kind of on the ground knowledge brokers and some of the policy focus that really looks at kind of the technical standards and how do you kind of adopt those continuously. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to kind of figure out how they come together a little bit better. And that's where I think electricians can play an exciting role as well. The regulations that exist in Kenya when it comes to electricians are actually much more capacity based. They're more looking at, in order to be certified, you have to have certain training and technical skills. But that does not apply to, these agents that are really associated with this kit-based model. And is there a way to kind of maybe bridge this a little bit better? Think more about this sector as a whole and not having these kind of agents and electricians or component-based solar and off-grid solar so kind of operating independently of one another. Does that kind of get at?
That's great, right? Thank you. We have a bunch of questions coming in from the audience now. Has theft of solar panels been a significant problem?
It certainly can be, and it can be a huge challenge. And so I'll share one, anecdotal story. So this is not necessarily representative of all the experiences, but that. Depending on what kind of system you have, especially if you have one of those systems that has a panel that is movable, and let's say you put it outside your house to charge during the day. In focus groups discussions, we heard of people who did have their panels stolen, and that's where some of these recourse, there's not a lot that can happen once that goes, and one of the issues that people identified was that there's a little bit of a gap in information of, like, when a panel is stolen or something happens, like, how do you effectively communicate that back to a solar provider, especially if your system is financed and you need to keep paying those payments, but someone stole your panel? What do you do? Right. And I think that's an open question.
Okay. So another question. In looking at potential factors, you did not use income. Wouldn't that make a difference in solar use?
I tested for income, and it wasn't significant. So it absolutely could, and it could be a factor in this sample that when we oversampled households with solar, and that could mean that we had less economic variation overall in our sample. That's a really good question, and you absolutely can, you know, see that relationship, and it just didn't come up in this data, but is absolutely one to think about.
Okay. Could you say a little more about the affordability aspect of solar in Kenya? I know the 1 Acre Fund has a lending microfinance scheme for solar, among other things. Has there been any move towards public or community ownership of solar to make it more viable for everyone?
It's a great question. So I'll start first by giving a little bit of background on what is one of the most common kind of ways of paying for solar right now, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of these other options. But the increasingly common way to make off-grid solar more affordable for people is to use a pay-as-you-go model, where people will make a deposit on their system and then pay back the system in kind of small and variable increments over time. And so as long as you can make that deposit payment, which is a huge if to a lot of rural farming family, you know, it can be pretty expensive, but if you can make that, then you have a financed approach to off-grid solar, which the terms of that range. But I think for the larger systems, most of them are paid off in under 2 years if you see it through the end. The opportunity for pay-as-you-go models, I think, has really unlocked, you know, a lot more access to off-grid solar. And then there's also, I think, you know, hand in hand, this is really the other side of consumer protections that I didn't talk about today. So I talked a lot about quality and technical measures. There's a whole nother side about kind of the financial consumer protections that go along with this. They are pretty steep interest rates. And there are questions about kind of when systems, when you fail to make a payment, systems will be shut off until you make your payment again. And different, from my experience talking with households, is some people really, really struggle with that, because if their solar system gets turned off because they couldn't pay, well, they have to try and find some other source of lighting, which they have to pay for, and it just kind of makes it harder to pay back, to get on track with their solar payments in the first place. So it's a little bit of a cycle of how do you start to build on this model and work on it to kind of really respond to community, you know, kind of like these variable income that households have in rural Kenya. But the pay-as-you-go model has really unlocked a lot of opportunity as well. When it comes to community or public ownership in the off-grid solar sector. So if you think back to that figure that I showed that went kind of Pico lanterns, home systems, microgrids to the grid, I've heard a lot more talk about kind of at least community ownership focused at the microgrid level, at larger scale technologies. A lot of the ways that these off-grid solar kind of household level systems are being provided are through partnerships. So in some cases, you'll have kind of NGOs partnering with companies to provide lanterns to certain areas. You will, in some cases, this isn't super common in Kenya, but I've seen it in India, have like a government partnership where there is some kind of you know, subsidy for lanterns. That is not the same thing as community ownership or public ownership of these, but those options are probably being more explored at the microgrid level. And from my work in Kenya and in India early on microgrids, you know, there is this interest in trying to figure out how to have the community engaged and responsible for kind of the longer term operations for those microgrids. But I would have to check on kind of the most recent evolution of that. It's been a few years since I've looked at that.
Here's a related question. Has your work shown whether consumers in a country like Kenya grapple more easily with information about product quality as opposed to energy access? Do they see themselves as purchasers of products, or are they beginning to see themselves as users and potential users of electricity from the standpoint of their vision of themselves as homeowners, farmers, or business people?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think that there is in the focus group conversations that we did, there is people think of solar a little bit differently than they think about the grid. And so we, people kind of think of solar as solar and electricity as the grid. And there's lots more to explore from this. These are very kind of like preliminary discussions that we had that started to show some of these patterns. But I think in that way, like this idea of the electricity coming from solar is really kind of like a product-based approach to this. And I think there's lots of questions about what that means for like long-term viability of electricity from a product like this, and how do you make it a lasting option for people. I don't think we've quite figured that out yet. But then how do do people really view it as a alternative to the grid? And I don't think we're there yet. So we asked, I don't remember the specific breakdown of this, but on this survey, we did ask people, like, if you have a solar system, do you still think you need grid electricity? And I don't remember the exact numbers, but by and large, people said, yes, we still want the grid.
Right.
And so we still have a ways to go until I think there's some kind of conceptual parity between these options in people's minds.
Okay, two more quick ones then. This one's on knowledge brokers. Do you have a sense of the variety, range, scope of information that these knowledge brokers are providing to decision makers? This questioner has seen evidence of solar installers shepherding their customers through the adoption decision-making process domestically and abroad.
Yeah. I think that characterization is pretty accurate. I mean, these knowledge brokers have a huge influence on that decision-making process for an individual who decides to kind of buy a particular solar product. And so that can be from really trying to understand what can you put on your solar system? How much is this going to cost? Which is a huge thing, and an area where maybe knowledge brokers aren't always the most honest about, what is that really going to take? But they play this huge role. And then it doesn't stop though, once people have access to that solar product. So the process will usually go that a knowledge broker, like an agent, will go out into a part of, so if we take Transoya County, we'll go out from the main town and go out into the kind of more countryside area and identify new people. They'll sign them up, and then usually there's kind of a verification process, and then the solar system will be delivered. But it's not just there where these knowledge brokers play a role, because oftentimes they will give this end user their phone number. And so it's also shepherding them through troubleshooting their system afterwards. And that's one area where I think we don't know a lot about yet, but I would say that characterization is really appropriate, that they play this really critical role throughout that.
And do you know where these brokers are getting their information?
Yeah, they go through trainings provided by the companies, and that varies based on the company, kind of what goes into those trainings. And it's where I see this potential opportunity to maybe build out more comprehensive and perhaps more universal trainings for agents like this through something like local vocational schools, which already exist in rural communities in Kenya anyway.
Well, we are at time, so I'd like to ask you to do a final wrap up and maybe just talk about what the plans are for this research, and then Stephen will jump on at the end to talk about upcoming events.
Yeah, so I'd say kind of a couple of my key takeaways, for everyone who's listening, if there were a couple of things to take away. One is that it really does matter kind of how we develop more meaningful measures of electricity access. And that can seem really apparent when you look at a case like Kenya, but that we all should kind of think about that in our daily lives as well, and in the context that we live. And that secondly, these modes of engagement are really important. So these knowledge brokers, these intermediaries that act to really facilitate that. And again, that we can reflect and think on that in our lives as well. But that we should also think about how to integrate these knowledge brokers into the existing ecosystem that is already there in rural communities, and how can we use resources to kind of bolster that ecosystem to make this a more lasting option for people when it comes to off-grid solar technologies. So I'll be continuing to work on this with my partners in Kenya. We will really continue diving in and hopefully try and work through a lot more on the electrician side. So we've spent a lot of time focused on off-grid solar agents, and I think there's a lot to explore in the same area about electricians, and that this can also connect some of the ways that electricians are working across solar, different types of solar. And then one really important, next layer of this is to start to think about concerns related to electronic waste management, and how do we build out the kind of infrastructure and systems that support that. So those are two of the areas up next for this work, and I'm happy to chat with anyone who has further questions offline.
Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Elise and Heidi. First, I wanted to thank our audience for their attendance and a great set of questions. I think both with respect to work in sub-Saharan Africa, but also the relationship to our own power system here in the United States. So again, thanks so much, Elise. Thanks so much, Heidi. And I think what we're going to do now as we just wrap up and say goodbye is you see here on the screen a set of upcoming events that we have sponsored by the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. And so I encourage everybody in attendance today to check those out as well and let your friends know. And again, thanks Heidi, thanks Elise, and take care.